Good evening. My name is Christophe Cherix, and I'm delighted to welcome you tonight for this discussion organized in conjunction with our current retrospective of the work of Marcel Broodthaers upstairs, that the Museum of Modern Art co-organized with Reina Sofia and its director Manuel Borja-Villel in Madrid. And in fact, the show will travel to Madrid in the fall and make a final stop in Düsseldorf at K20 in the spring of 2017. I'd like to thank our Department of Education for working with us on tonight's program, and also the Broodthaers family for their support throughout this exhibition. Particularly Maria Gillissen, the artist's widow, who is with us tonight. Maria, thank you for preserving Broodthaers' work during all those years in order us to enjoy it today, and for your great help throughout this project. In our curatorial team, I'm especially grateful to Francesca Wilmot and Marina Molarski-Beck for their continuous help. Tonight's event follows Monday night's program dedicated to Broodthaers films. We had the pleasure to have with us Bruce Jenkins at this occasion, and precedes a poetry evening which will take place in the exhibition itself on this coming Monday, on May 9th, with Elizabeth Zuba and 6 of her fellow poets. So you are welcome to also join us at this occasion, and on our website you should find all the information related to it. In tonight's program, we will discuss Broodthaers' influence on contemporary artists. It's very fitting for an artist who felt deeply connected to an assembly of extraordinary writers and artists who preceded him. On one side, you have Jean de La Fontaine, Stéphane Mallarmé, Charles Baudelaire, and on the other, René Magritte, Kurt Schwitters, and Marcel Duchamp. And on that slide, you see 3 of them brought together by Broodthaers, Magritte, Mallarmé, and La Fontaine. So it's very fitting for his work to have enjoyed such a fertile and vibrant legacy in the generations who came after him. There are few contemporary issues that the work of Marcel Broodthaers has left untouched, Among the many themes that feel particularly relevant today are the function of an art object, the role of the museum, the relationship between language and art, art and authority, art and commerce, the artist as a curator, the obsolescence of mediums, and of course the role of the viewer. We have the pleasure tonight to have two artists to explore those ideas and discuss their own understanding of Broodthaers' works and its impact on their practices. Dominique Gonzalez-Foerster and Rodney Graham. So thank you, Dominique. Thank you, Rodney, for being with us tonight. Dominique was born in Strasbourg and lives in Paris and Rio de Janeiro. An extraordinary retrospective of her work was just organized by the Centre Pompidou in Paris, Dominique Gonzalez-Foerster, 1887 to 2058. In my mind, a title echoing the subtitle Broodthaers gave to his own Oxford retrospective, 1249 to 1975. The exhibition is currently on view at K20 in Düsseldorf through August 7th. In New York, Dominique's work was the subject of a beautiful DIA-organized exhibition at the Hispanic Society in 2009 and can regularly be seen at 303 Gallery. Rodney Graham is based in Vancouver. As with Dominique, his work needs little introduction. His work has been shown internationally since the 70s in a number of major solo exhibitions, more recently at the Art Institute of Chicago in 2013, MAGBA in Barcelona in 2010, and at the Galerie du Jeu de Paume in Paris in 2009. In New York, his work was first presented by Christine Bergin and is regularly on view at 303 Gallery. We are proud to say that MoMA's collection includes, among other things, a complete set of his books, multiples, and ephemera. In those, à la Broodthaers, Rodney introduced into his own work a constellation of great minds from the past, from Edgar Allan Poe and Stéphane Mallarmé to Richard Wagner and Sigmund Freud. After me, Dominique and Rodney will each give a presentation considering Broodthaers' work in relationship to their practices. Afterward, they will join Cathleen Chaffee and me on stage. Cathleen is senior curator at the Albright-Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo. She formerly worked at Yale University Art Gallery and earlier here at MoMA, where we had the chance to work together and share a mutual passion for Broodthaers. She went on to complete in 2013 her dissertation on Marcel Broodthaers' late career exhibition practice and Décors. Cathleen will begin the conversation responding to Dominique and Rodney's presentation and considering the influence of Broodthaers today. Our discussion will open to a Q&A, and we would welcome your questions then. Please join me in welcoming Dominique Gonzalez-Foerster.
Merci, Christophe. I will try my best in English, but you have to forgive a bit of French accent. Well, I hope it adds a charm, and that will make for the mistakes, make up for the mistakes. So when I received Christophe's email, I was excited on many levels, but one was a strange coincidence, is that I realized that the retrospective I was working on in Düsseldorf shared the same space, city, and as the retrospective here. And so retrospective is maybe the first word to interrogate there, and that can become an interesting subject rather than something problematic, maybe something to work with. And I realized again yesterday, walking around the exhibition, how fertile it is to go into a meta exhibition, meta fiction, rather than remain blocked on the first meanings. My first thought was to identify a series of figures and topics through specific works, and starting from the coming from literature, poetry, and the desire to be a writer, which has also been my very first wish, but a kind of failed one. And so I made a collection of images. This is about wanting to be a writer. This is about its costume, the importance of costume, and exciting to find the word again and again in Le Corbeau, and so costume becoming a central part. It's also something that made me think a lot of Rodney, but I think the importance of has something to do with mise en scène, mise en œuvre, metteur en œuvre, and is maybe a compression of a miniature version of the studio, the artist studio. We missed, we went fast on Mallarmé, but we come back on that. It was also a beautiful surprise yesterday in the Degas exhibition to come across the Mallarmé portrait by Degas and to see how Mallarmé as a ghost is in almost every museum. Cinema, of course, but as a presence. And then I haven't found the right words for that yet, but somehow the construction of is beyond genealogy, and it's beyond quotation, and it's maybe it's the way certain writers like Sorrentino or certain type of metafiction or maximalist novels, the way also Thomas Pynchon is using so many references, but how bring up a complex landscape. Well, even Proust was mastering this by the use of names. So it's not only the importance of words like décor or costume, but also names. And l'entrée de l'exposition, which is for me contains maybe the more important elements. Exhibition as a medium, meta exhibition, and exhibition being the central tool for thinking, and also a kind of heterotopia in the Foucault sense, where it's possible to join many levels of many different languages, levels of meanings, type of objects, connecting, so words, objects, plants, with cinema, names, numbers, dates. For the 1887 2058 retrospective in Paris, I also used plants at the entrance because it's what was done for the opening show of the Pompidou in '77. Believe it or not, the Duchamp exhibition was full with plants. Maybe it was an idea by Pontoise-Sultan, and I guess it was strongly influenced by Broodthaers. So I don't have a view of it, but I also used lots of plants at the entrance in Paris. Not in Düsseldorf, so now this is the entrance in Düsseldorf. I believe that there is a weird connection between the Brasilia Hall and l'entrée de l'exposition, but also the Jardin d'Hiver, in terms of bringing a dimension into the exhibition that relates to another set of references. Here the modernist city. A second room is completely about the notion of costume and connecting. It's like a biography in textile, so it was also shown here. But what's most important here for me to point at, and very Broodthaers in a sense, is the piece of furniture in the center, this green velvet. I don't know if you call it, what's the technical name? It's a fauteuil pouf in English. And it's, for me, it acts very much as a special effect in the exhibition because it comes from the Musée de Grenoble, where I grew up. And I was sitting on this green velvet as a child, looking at the paintings there at the Musée de Grenoble. And it really, as a piece of furniture, it offers the panoptic possibility, but it's also a kind of flying saucer coming from this early viewer experience into the exhibition. And therefore, for me, it's almost the most important part of the exhibition. The textorama has a strong relation with Mallarmé and Apollinaire. Is combining the Mallarmé's research with Apollinaire's calligram into a landscape that is also bringing up how words and language can completely become part of an exhibition without necessarily being paratext or explanation, but gaining another level. Facing the textorama, you don't see it, is the beautiful diorama of a desert, and contains different books. Books being an essential component of the research, and one of the books being 2666 by Roberto Bolaño. This is just a pleasure to share Edgar Allan Poe and Mallarmé and again and again. It's entering one of my dreams tonight, and I told Rodney, was to work on a double costumed apparition, but unfortunately Düsseldorf gave me so much trouble that we couldn't, but maybe another time. But I was really fantasizing that we could both have and I had two thoughts. I would have loved to try either Igniture's costume or Mallarmé, to make a copy, or I had another. It's a bit more strange, but it's connecting with Severus Rogue, the character from Harry Potter, the Dark Magician, because my daughter says I look very much like him. So. This is for me the important, again, to the costume, the importance of the hat, but beyond that, the way again, it brings so many different connections in one place. And this is a promenade as Aschenbach in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. I think the Splendid Hotel, the first version was at the Palacio de Cristal in Paris, and it's another strange connection because the exhibition will go to the Reina Sofia. And the Splendid Hotel is emerges in 1887, and also in Rimbaud's Illuminations from the chaos of ice, and is a place I think the construction owns very much to Marcel Broodthaers. In Düsseldorf, it is next to another very XXL room, which is a remake of TH2058, now called K2066, and where sculptures are protected from the rain and appears as giant quotations, and making it possible, together with books, rests of films, and to do a kind of very Godardian montage. And the more I was diving into the whole thing, the more I was thinking that the way the freedom Godard allows himself in the Histoire du cinéma is very similar to that heterotopian way to see exhibition as an open playground with variable entrances for all types of. Here the bricks, of course, yesterday when I saw the bricks, I was. and another kind of, so a very early work restaged with bricks being the construction material, together with a painting by Paul Klee, which is mentioned in a book by Enrique Villamatas in relation to a museum guard, Rosa Schwerzer. It's a short story which will come out in English too, and where this is the last room in the exhibition, and bumps back into the beginning and the decor. And the last image I wanted to have is the atlas. I was so excited leaving the exhibition to see that I had somehow in Düsseldorf I had a parallel intuition by doing a miniature guide for the exhibition, and Christophe, this is for you.
Thank you very much, Dominique. Now please join Ronnie Graham. Thank you.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Christophe. It's an incredible show, and I spent a lot of time in it this afternoon. It kind of made me think maybe I should change the text that I've already written, in which I'm going to read, putting on the hat of an art historian a little bit, talking about my work in relationship to Broodthaers. Also, it's kind of touches a little bit on what Dominique has been, one aspect of her talk, this idea of costume. I'm going to speak specifically of this ad of Broodthaers in relationship to a work that I did that involved a shirt. I'm going to read it. Here's a 1971 advertisement for Van Lack shirts, which appeared in the German magazine Der Spiegel in 1971, and which featured Broodthaers as a model. I presume he did it for money. He always needed it, like most artists. The owners of the company were collectors, and later Broodthaers gave them a folded white shirt with a dedication on the cuff, perhaps a New Year's gift. The caption below the Van Lack photograph reads, the director of the Musée d'Art Moderne, Département des Aigles, refused to wear the Van Lack monocle. I can find no further reference to the Van Lack monocle, but one thinks immediately of the Hathaway eye patch. Oh, sorry, it's missing. Anyways, oh, sorry, I'm going to go back here. It's not working. Oh, well, forget it. I guess it didn't work. Perhaps the photographer wanted to evoke the famous American ad campaign, which turned a small local Maine shirt maker into the #1 producer of dress shirts in the world, but Broodthaers thought better of it. He was right. It would have been too much. The cigar is enough. I must have known of this image in '92 when, in my belatedness, I staged my own modest intervention into the fashion world, collaborating with the Belgian designer Anne de Meulemeester on a white shirt. A shirt I never modeled, though Anne made it in my size. I certainly did know of the importance of Stéphane Mallarmé for Broodthaers when we titled the work White Shirt for Mallarmé Image. Oh, there it is. Kind of the precursor to the most interesting man in the world. That's the shirt that I made, very similar, as you can see. I had the privilege of working on the project with my great friend Yves Gavert, who knew Broodthaers well, having curated 2 exhibitions of the artist at the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Brussels, and who collaborated on several publications with him, including Pauvre Belgique. He spoke often of Broodthaers, and I believe Yves showed me a copy of Broodthaers' recasting of Mallarmé's Coup de Dé. Broodthaers had a poetical sensibility. He was, after all, a poet and did not stop being one, even after he became an artist. I find no reference in his work to an early prose poem by Mallarmé called The Demon of Analogy, though this does not mean he doesn't know it. It was this poem that I had printed on the kind of cardstock around which shirts are folded, at least in North America, when they return from the dry cleaners. Some of the words of the poem, "The penultimate is dead," I'm giving you the English, are detached from the rest of the text, since they are printed on the kind of transparent tissue otherwise used by dry cleaners and which is superimposed on the card. I know where this came from, the edition of Coup de Dé by Broodthaers printed on transparent cigarette paper. It's a beautiful installation of the room. The room is very beautiful, in which this piece appears. I guess this was first shown at a wide white space, and I've kind of, anyways, it's kind of been very important to me. In Mallarmé's poem, the poet leaves his apartment and finds himself muttering an absurd phrase under his breath, "Le penultième est mort," where the null sound is accompanied in a kind of synesthesia by the mental image of a bird's wing drawn bow-like in a downward caressing movement across the strings of an instrument. He tries to interpret it, but it defies analysis. Penultième, however, reminds him of his daily struggle, what the poet does for money. He teaches English. The penultième is the second to last syllable of a word, sometimes stressed in English, never in French. The word keeps rhythmically tumbling around in his head, detaching themselves even further from meaning, approaching a pure musicality as he walks. He finds himself in a street of antiquarian dealers, pausing in front of a lute maker's shop, where in the window's reflection he sees himself making a downward strumming gesture, and beyond that, within the shop, a tableau of birds' wings, palm fronds, and stringed instruments. In the shop window tableau, he sees the crystallization of an image in his linguistic delirium. The poetical exploration of pure coincidence is what Breton later cultivated and called objective chance, and which led him to the flea market for the concrete materialization of his own delirium around the phrase Cinderella ashtray. What found him there was nothing more than a wooden salad spoon resting on a tiny boot. Broodthaers' own tableau carried the idea of the poetic object of surrealism to another level, to a kind of hilarious apotheosis in the idea of décor, of the installation, the private museum. Here he was especially prescient. Of words and images and things, often presided over by palms, symbols of victory, and by the ultimate image of triumph, the imperial eagle. The expression institutional critique hardly does justice to the degree of this irony. For Broodthaers, Mallarmé's masterpiece Coup de Dé was the perfect zero point of modernism, for he introduced into poetry the idea of the spatial distribution that already opened out into the possibility of painting and sculpture. something that the artist's own recasting of the entirely redacted poem is a cascade of black rectangles made clear. I noticed in the exhibition that in a small two-part work from 71 called My Collection, I believe, which includes an image of the shirt advertisement. There's a famous portrait of Mallarmé, and it's kind of labeled figure 0, which I kind of found quite significant. I have to again announce my belatedness in having written an homage to Mallarmé's opus as a kind of sublimation of my desire late in life for a tattoo. The poem takes the form of an open letter à la Broodthaers, a letter addressed to an unnamed tattooist describing a tattoo which would cover my entire back. It was published by Yves and Saskia Gavert, and the typography loosely mimics that of coup de day. In fact, I mimicked it as closely as I could. I'm going to read this poem and I dedicate it to Marcel Broodthaers. It's a poem that kind of, in a way, I did think it kind of evoked some of his idea of a bestiary, and also some of his poems about deep sea creatures. So here goes. Popeye, in a deep sea diving suit, delivers a KO punch to a giant squid, which recoiling corkscrews up from the depths. With its tentacles wound tight, squeezed and twisted like the strands of some gargantuan floor mop, its beak forming an inane smile and its eyes, now twinned X's, signifying the bliss of oblivion, releases clouds of blue-black ink into the region of my right shoulder and lower neck. In leaden boots that root him to the ocean's floor, the storied sailor stands bareheaded astride the battle-dislodged diving helmet and the hose which entangles him before winding on, finally losing itself in the miasma of squid ink that muddles the waters above. While from the bowl of the still-clenched corncob pipe, jutting obliquely from the imposing jaw of the brawling maritime hero, bubbles emerge and likewise ascend. Also in the scene, a sea chest, open, spilling gold coins, precious jewels, and treasure of all kinds. Thank you.
So Cathleen will start with a few remarks.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you so much for those presentations. I kind of am stepping back a moment into a little bit of history with Broodthaers before I want to move forward, and then we'll move forward as a group in conversation around these presentations that I think were so fascinating. It's been common in reviews of this exhibition, and I think in conversations of Broodthaers' work more generally, to describe him, and very rightly so, as an artist's artist. And I think there are few artists that we get more close to the paradox of that expression and what that really means. There are many reasons, I think, and many opportunities to speculate on why he has been an artist who's spoken to so many other artists. But before we kind of attempt to maybe have that discussion, I wanted to introduce, I think, two kind of parallel ways that he may have left the door open for the state of things and for the influence on, at least two such great artists who are here with us today. He was an active participant in poetry circles long before he became a visual artist. And from that moment forward, he was very influential on the people that he knew. There are a few people whose life he touched personally who didn't remember and didn't tell, I think, phenomenal stories about what it was like to know him when he was coming into being as an artist. He also created areas for conversation and for provocation through his work, sometimes for conversations that were thwarted. And I think influence and dialogue go together. So that's for me, a big part of what he was creating with a work like his Museum of Modern Art, Department of Aigles. This is the inaugural the inaugural event opening the museum, which then for at least a year in his Brussels apartment was not just a quote-unquote installation. It wasn't just, I think, what we see in many photographs of crates piled against walls, presented almost like a sculptural experience. This was a site for discussion. This was a site for conversation. And I think that's a big part of the influence Broodthaers felt. This is another example, a later work of his from 1974. We can see one example of a site for discussion here, devoid of people, not populating it. But this is an image of Gilbert and George at the opening of the exhibition that included that installation. And one of my favorite features is that the seats in the installation are piled high with cocktail glasses because the bar was located in the Décors, full of life and full of discussion. In terms of Broodthaers' influence, we have these two phenomenal artists on stage, but it's almost like a wonderful party when at the end you say, oh gosh, you know, we really should have invited more, we could have invited everyone. And I think that's something that we've all experienced, and I could mention a few artists in addition to the two with us, from Tessa Dedin to Rikrit Tiravanija, Pierre Huyghe, Rachel Harrison, Joelle Tourlinks, many others who have navigated the road between influence and creation in incredibly creative ways. The important kind of other second note I wanted to make in terms of context is I think a big reason, and Christophe alluded to this in his introductory remarks, that he has been so influential is because he gave permission to cite him through his frequent citation of other artists. He freely and often cited the work of others. And that includes sort of from the 19th century, the works of 19th century art that he was so fascinated by that he included in this first museum, to those that he felt had lessons to teach us. This is an image from the Wiertz Museum in Brussels, an artist that Broodthaers felt had many lessons to teach about the transience of fame and also infamy, an artist who was once quite celebrated, and during Broodthaers' lifetime, the museum was constantly under threat of closure because nobody visited it anymore. And this is him taking James Lee Byers to the museum. I've been told that he frequently took guests, people who passed through Brussels. This was one of the important stops. And references obviously to Magritte, as anyone visiting the exhibition upstairs has noticed. This is an installation included on view, Éloge de Sujet, and then Magritte's versions of his Les Clés des Songes. So objects labeled with words that don't perfectly correspond. And perhaps I don't need to meditate further on Mallarmé in addition to what we've spoken about today. I think here, however, and jumping off of Rodney's presentation, we have a key way that Broodthaers gave, in my opinion, so much permission for homage as well as for reference. And I think it's through his own precedent. It was his unwillingness, in many ways, to let a good thing fade into the oblivion of critique or of straightforward analysis. And his many statements about the power of poetry, more generally just than what we get with reference. And I'd like to kind of turn the topic of conversation just by reading one quote that I've always loved by Broodthaers. He said, "Poetry troubles the codes with which we develop explanations. It deranges the habits and power in the world where we always try to explain everything and where we always and everywhere wish to impose order." When I was speaking briefly with Dominique before these presentations, she used a wonderful expression that made me think of all of the works in Broodthaers' career that had to do with navigation and exploration. You spoke about visiting the exhibition upstairs and being happy in a way that you hadn't been familiar with as many of the works as you now are when you were a younger artist. I think, as you said, because the power of his influence was so strong. And you made me think of a sea captain kind of navigating a rocky shoal, which is that you have to draw a very, very careful line between creation and influence, between permission and I think being stifled or stymied by influence. And I thought that was very interesting. What we have on stage, as far as that goes, are two very sure sailors, in my opinion, able, I think, to process be inspired and be influenced, but also go in your own direction and make your own work. One of the key takeaways I had from your presentations was I liked the conversation about costume, and I'd love to return to that in our discussion. But one of them was the joy and pleasure of sharing references. And I'm reminded of the fact that so often I think references are thought to be maybe elitist. You know, we refer to an obscure ode to an 18th century count or a prince, which is something Broodthaers was love to do. But these aren't presented to close people out, and I don't think they are in your work either. There's a joyfulness, I think, in using a reference to open up a possibility for conversation. So it's an invitation to read, as opposed to an exclusion for the person who may not yet be familiar with the text. And that was something I thought was fascinating in the presentation. So let's see, we could have questions if you have a question, or I'm happy to ask Dominique a question.
Please.
From her work. Okay. So we have more slides. This is a work you didn't include in your presentation, and it's one I've always been quite fond of. And then seeing your interest in Edgar Allan Poe, it made me think of a quote from the Philosophy of Furniture by Poe, which is from 1840. He said, "A judge at common law may be an ordinary man. A good judge of a carpet must be a genius." And I thought about that looking back again at this work, and again, two very different modes. One with no readers, one where books are presented as references, as allusions to things you love and things you may have loved to read, and as an architecture, I think, of learning. And another where they're activated, although I must say nobody seems to have a book in their hands. Broodthaers often presented books, yet kind of impeded access to them. So in his exhibitions and installations, you get books that are treated aesthetically, that invite you to look in, but you can't flip through them. And of course, there's the wonderful precedent in one of his very first sculptures, Pense Bête, which is on view upstairs. I wonder if I could ask you to speak a little bit about how you think about access to citation or reading, and maybe not just in a work like this, but in other works.
In that case, the very first version of a tapis de lecture happened for the exhibition Voilà at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, which was about artists and archive. And it was just the idea to have an open bibliography for the work. So instead of hiding the references or keeping them, making them the center, and it's called the tapis de lecture, so reading carpet, and very much reproduction of the own carpet I had and the piles of books. So it's really like backstage becoming front stage, and it's about 20 different books, but in original language and translations. So it's not all books are different, they're repeated. And yes, I like very much that you can really read them, and that there is a kind of confusing moments about the status of these books and these texts, and in fact how they, when you were speaking earlier about the importance of reference and how to, I have absolutely no, I think, and this is why the expression the artist as a curator is so for me so full of sense and so important. I have absolutely no in that sense, I'm very close to Benjamin and Broodthaers in including any type of material, whatever it is, you know. I think any material has a right to enter an artwork, and it's in fact it's going beyond certain boundaries in terms of what comes into the alchemy that makes it interesting. And this heterotopic aspect, I think, is exactly where it might happen. This is what excites me every time I see Rodney's work, is that there is also music, text, characters, fiction enter with the same on the same ground level.
I want to say that I've done my own share of exhibiting books and denying people access to them by making these sculptures with Freud tech books in them, and I was thinking of the comment of Broodthaers and the work that there are no primary structures. That everything is inscribed in language, and that's always been interesting to me. But yeah, I mean, the problem of exhibiting books as artworks is perennial. Providing access is one thing, but if you want to, obviously Broodthaers said it all really with Paul Spett. But anyway.
I wonder if you could each talk a little bit about how you started your work as an artist, because Rodney, you mentioned that you read Raymond Roussel, and in a way you say somewhere that it was really the beginning of your work more as a visual artist. And Dominique, you just referred to you as a failed writer. So of course it echoes Marcel Broodthaers very deeply, who was a poet for a couple of decades. Could you talk a bit about the transition between text and image, and how for you it became most logical to morph into a visual artist?
For me, when I first went to university, I was interested in perhaps pursuing a course in literature. I took pursuing a career in literature. I took a course from my now friend Ian Wallace, an fine art survey course, and in general, just the openness of the art world was something that attracted me. It was much more interesting at that time for me in that particular context than the literary world that I saw in any case. And one thing that came up, he was discussing in one lecture, discussing Raymond Roussel in relationship to Duchamp, and I sought out Impressions of Africa, this very unusual book, and it just the way that language was used as almost like the object character of it as well was interesting, and his strange methodologies that evoked actually artistic possibilities for me. So it was almost one of those things, a literary experience that kind of brought me into art. And I can really relate though to Broodthaers' kind of, I suppose, renunciation. Not renunciation of poetry, but the appeal of visual art in a period where it seemed very, very open. And his comment about insincerity always really kind of interests me as well, because obviously the possibility of doing something motivated by insincerity seems to open up possibilities. You're not required to be sincere about it, first of all. So it seemed to be the possibilities opened up for him with the possibilities of visual art, and that interests me too.
Dominique, do you want to?
Yeah, I think that starting as wanting to be a writer, but also discovering that the visual arts was a more exciting playground in a way, but also having a chance to bring in operation and strategies from literature into the visual field, and playing with that, because I think at the end it's many operations together that turn up, and I think I never lose the feeling that we're in front of a new type of text in the exhibition, and that if there wasn't all this literature background, the whole questioning on object, its autonomy, exhibition would be completely different. I think it emanates from a very text-based, philosophical, poetry-based. It's a sort of expanded poetry. I see it this way, and in that way, for me, it's very successful. But the fact that exhibition as a medium can contain this possibility is,
But in order to do that, you almost have to redefine the place of the viewer.
And be very
so
critical.
suddenly when text become, I'm thinking about your work also, like your text intervention, you're asking the viewer to become a reader and to have a completely different relationship to the artwork that you offer. Is it something like this place of the viewer and how he or she interacts with the work important to you?
Yeah, I have to say that I've moved a little bit away from that, partly because of this whole problem of exhibiting books. And I was just, Broodthaers' books were so beautiful and very influential on me, from a design viewpoint, from like an aesthetic viewpoint. And I was always I was interested in making beautiful books, but exhibiting them and also producing them was so labor intensive that frankly I moved away from it, and I've taken another course. So I mean, when I think of Broodthaers, I think of part of something that relates more to my past, but for that reason, I suppose.
Another element which I found so interesting to think about in relation to Broodthaers' also early work are your films. Both of you came to receive a more international recognition through films very much at the beginning, and those films are not the typical films. You know, you're not filmmakers. Broodthaers said he wasn't a filmmaker. You're not trained as filmmakers, and your film kind of oscillate between the idea of document and work. You know, if you think of Broodthaers' first work, the one which opens the exhibition, The Key to the Clock, the homage to Kurt Schwitters, he called it a kind of documentary. So something which is somehow in between. And if I think of Halcyon Day, if I think of Rio or Plage, those films too, somehow they just try to find a new position for film in relation to other mediums.
That film was a bit of a revelation to me, very beautiful. I like the use of the flashlight. It's something that I didn't know about this, but it kind of something that I thought it kind of relates to my own work early work with using artificial light sources in film, and yeah, and I also I appreciated the kind of amateur aspect of it, which is something that I've always tried to keep in my work. I obviously never saw myself as a filmmaker.
Dominique, anything to say about the early films?
Yeah, I like that it relates to this pre-talking movie moment, and very specific in terms of, but also that it acquires like cinema. Again, acquires a very strong presence, not only like in a way when you would use a part of another film or something, but really the cinematic presence transforms also the reading of I think it's very strong in the Jardin d'Hiver, where through being refilmed and re-injecting the images into the exhibition moment, accomplishes an incredible loop for my...
that was unexpected for me as well, that experience.
But I think this is something that's so interesting about that is how the traditional relationship of a spectator in the cinematic experience is undone in Broodthaers, and is also, I think, undone, I mean, I'm thinking specifically Dominique in this case, but through the chambre that you've made, which... I think, like Broodthaers, you've sort of rejected the term of installation, he kind of turned himself towards the term décor, related to decoration and decorum and all sorts of other terms not normally part of contemporary art. I wonder, do you see a relationship between the sort of cinematic spectator or the... he declared the camel that he brought into the ground floor of the Palais des Beaux-Arts was not part of the exhibition. He was an actor in the film, and that was his role, and he sort of stood firmly on that. And for me, I think many of the people participating in your chambre or your environments are, I wonder if you could talk about, do you see them more as actors, as performers in a way, or spectators in a traditional cinematic sense?
I like the idea to see it as a kind of stage where I had a period where I was really against actors, and very much against theater also, so reacting against that. Therefore, I still think exhibition is an open field to something else than acting, something in between, I don't know, something to be defined differently. And the chambre were really, it makes me think of this importance. I also admire so much in his work to try to find the right words for the thing and really work on the vocabulary in order to bring in new typologies and a different reading. And so the category of chambre, I think décor is probably a word I have considered, but maybe rejected but it's really related to the set, but also to the analogy between exhibition and the exhibition of the self we do every day in our own rooms, and how it's very much about, I think what I also enjoy a lot is very much about in his research, and is very philosophical for me. It's a lot about genre and format, and it's through observing the categories, the museum, the decor, naming them, that comes up the possibility of constructing a type of work, but also a type of reception that is completely different, but that might take longer than other works because the construction is made of it's operating on other levels. I don't know if you see it this way or.
No, absolutely. I think it's a very good point. One question I had also in relation to your practice as an artist. One of the things which keep amazing me in Broodthaers' work is that he really tried to expand what we think of an artist. It's just like the role of an artist really at the core of his practice. That's part of his work almost. And one of the things, he moved as a museum director, he moved as a curator also. And in fact, in a way, somehow both of you have tried to think about an expanded role of the artist, not being attached to a medium, being able to freely navigate from more like something which is thought as more like a popular medium, or is something which is more directly related to the fine art. So to think about those boundaries as something extremely fluid. And one thing that I was thinking when I was just preparing this evening is it came back to my mind the exhibition you curated in the 90s, like the Winter of Love with Purple Prose or Moment Ginza. For me, they were extremely important. Sure. And did I really realize at the time that they were created by an artist? Maybe not. But how do you see yourself in terms of both being able to make works and to have a contribution of your own, but also to bring things together or try to create a decor of your own with artists that you feel related or singular to a moment?
I stay right out of curating myself. I leave it to the professionals, but...
Now, on my side, it comes from strong doubts about the position of the artist, So I started, when I finished art school the same year, I did a training for curators where I met great people, but which also somehow made it clear for me that I didn't want to choose, and that this operation of curating, this is why the sentence artist as a curator, and I think in fact, it's maybe one of the most important things for me, and established also great playgrounds with curators in the sense of strong empathy for this activity and strong interest for and maybe this also gave me more freedom in the sense of, in a Walter Benjamin sense of saying an artwork is made of quotation of that and this, and this is, it's exactly this what I find enchanting in the exhibition. I think in that sense, and I think by now it's even, how to say, I mean, you have to imagine that all the work is pre-internet, pre-Google, pre all this type of research, but that the way it is making a graph, connecting things, is really looking into that direction of well, like maximalist novels, of very informed works, very detailed, very this I find.
Yeah, it was an achievement back in the day, pre-internet. Now, the idea of curation has become
it's very banal,
almost devalued.
Totally.
Everything is curated. I mean,
from food to
food, whatever. Which is fine, but. I want to go. Sorry, I want to go back to your thing about the I didn't realize that he called the camel and treated the camel as an actor, as a performer. I kept on thinking when I was going over this assignment to kind of relate my work to Broodthaers. It's a piece that I did where I used an animal as a parrot, a very Broodthaerian kind of. And a palm tree, and I don't think I was thinking of for this piece called Vexation Island, a film that I made, and I must have had him in the back of my mind, but I wasn't thinking consciously.
For me, it was obvious when I read your name in the email. Vexation Island came like.
You look, but you don't look too closely because you're afraid. And Broodthaers is one of those artists for me.
That's what I said. I wrote to Christophe yesterday after the visit. I was like, I was disturbed. I thought maybe, it's in a kind of Philip K. Dick novel where it was pre-written and I was just executing the works to fit with this exhibition. And I was like, oh no.
And here you are tonight.
I'm just a product, of Marcel Broodthaers' imagination. Amazing.
One thing which is always challenging with organizing a Broodthaers exhibition is his own relation to the idea of museum. He really wanted to redefine it, and every time you try to do a retrospective of his work, you're going to fail. There is something like he can't, he organized his own retrospective, and he did that in order to react to what the museum stood for. So here we are, in a way, bringing the work back into where he tried basically to escape. And I wanted to hear a little bit about, from both of you, about your relationship to museums. Rodney, I think you've been so involved in music and in different fields also. And how do you see the museum able to bring all those threads together, or you feel that your work exists need to exist out of museum also?
No, I don't so much have a problem with that. Well, one thing that just made me think of my relationship as a Canadian, and I was so happy to see in the atlas that the page open at page 10 and 11, which is the map of Belgium and Canada. And they're both the same size, exactly. But it's my relationship to European culture. So I mean, I didn't really pick up on the same critical impulse behind his work. I never responded to it. It was more for me, kind of. Very humorous, kind of glamorous, but very humorous. But I have to say the institutional critique part of it somehow slightly escaped me. There are other aspects of his work that drew me in. The idea of coming out of literature, the idea of the continuation of literature by other visual means. So I would have to say, yeah, I mean, maybe not so much.
And I just put up a slide of Rodney's that makes me think about the pose of the artist and the way that you may not have embraced the curatorial role, but I think many of the fictions of the artist and artist as a performer in himself, I think you've created something.
Yeah, I mean,
really
I love that about Broodthaers. I mean, his kind of let's just say his elegance and. Model, I suppose, something I do in my work.
Dominique, would you say how you see the museum today? I mean, your work sometimes is extremely challenging to to just simply show in a museum setting. You know, also there is a way for you to exist outside the confine of a museum. What are the limitations of a museum today, if any?
Well, as you know, sometimes I've practiced what I call the plan for escape. You know,
Very successfully.
instead of staying inside, like, you know, going into the park, going in concert halls, going in the film festival. By now, I see more the question of the genre and the format, and I think in that sense it has. But I always, for any exhibition, question every part. You know, like from the paratext to the title. I think in that sense I'm probably problematic, you know, because I take nothing for obvious.
And you very much question the idea of retrospective in your last show, because it's really an artist-organized retrospective.
It is the time, there, place. I was so excited when I read that for the Oxford exhibition, the dates and all this played such a role, because I think there is and I guess it's the same. There's the time, there is the moment which is contained in the work, which is sometimes much more important than when it was done, you know, and all these different times. So let's say 1887 for the Splendid Hotel for me makes much more sense than 2014, you know, and so the retrospective is always exploring all these time zones and putting them together without any problem.
1887 is very important for me too, actually.
Is it?
Well, I did a piece about one of Freud's dreams that took place in March of 1887, and it actually, yeah.
Researching the year?
Researching, yeah.
And there's a dream of the unfinished book, is it that?
Yeah.
It's the dream of the botanical monograph,
Yes.
and it was, I think it was March
Yeah.
1887.
In this, and it's, of course, is the birth year of Duchamp, Le Corbusier, many others, Georgia O'Keeffe, but it's also the birth year of many ideas and theories and books,
Exactly,
and Le Horla by Maupassant. So I see it as the birth date of our, you know, the time we're still in, more or less.
I think it's a perfect moment, because now we are back into the 19th century. we circle back to the very beginning to take a few questions from the public, if you have any. So I think we have someone on each side with a microphone, so please raise your hand. Someone up there? Hi.
Hello?
Hello.
Yeah, if you just speak loud, I can repeat your question too.
So,
you only started to mention the word fiction at the end of the talk, because there's the fiction of the museum, the fiction of the persona who wears costume. So just open question for whoever wants to answer. But so maybe what Broodthaers did was create a big fiction of himself as an artist.
Was Broodthaers a fiction? Kathleen, do you want to
No.
try to?
He was not a fiction.
And why that?
I mean, I think the term fiction has been applied to his work quite a bit, and I think, speaking of permissions and how that certain terms and certain phrases can open doors, I think the theory of fictions and the possibility that might entail are really attractive, and they have been for a lot of writers. But I think Broodthaers was very sincere in his insincerity. And as a museum director, it's a performance, but it was also a real work of art for him. And this is quite a literal answer to your question. I think the permission of a conversation around fiction and his personas and his costumes and his changing of hats and all of those things are performative, but not necessarily, in my interpretation, fictional. But I would love to hear, actually, Rodney talk about that.
No, I don't think he was making a persona when he became an artist. I think he saw a real opportunity to do something different than he was doing, and I think he was genuine in his desire to be an artist, albeit a poetical.
He was sincere in his insincerity.
I think the insincerity. Maybe I was trying to think what he was thinking about. You know, pop art, maybe some aspect of pop that he saw as an opportunity. You know, to play. But I'm not certain, obviously.
But I think also, just 1 second, that when you're kind of going back to the beginning and the first time he used the term insincerity, but the kind of the persona and the performance is something I think you've engaged with really directly in your work, is the way an artist can embody different parts of art history through their own being. And I think that's something he did really convincingly, but with humor, which can be read as insincerity, but I think, as your work has shown, humor doesn't necessarily connect necessarily to fiction.
Yeah, it's quite different. I mean, what my role playing, I would see, is quite different from Broodthaers. So I don't think he was. I think I agree. Even when he was being a curator, it wasn't like the same kind of role playing that I'm doing in my work, where I've just done that to try to. I mean, I do that to try to find my way through my place in photography, really, without having any technical ability. I just thought, well, I'll be an actor or a film, or as in the context of film as well, as to actor, director, executive producer, or whatever. You know, Tom Cruise. I always refer to him.
Do we have another question? We'll come to you just in a second. Let's take the person in the middle row. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much. It makes me feel sad that Broodthaers himself wasn't around to see these amazing heirs to his work, the way Marguerite got to see people working on his work. So I think he would have been incredibly happy to have you as his heirs. One of the things that struck me most about Broodthaers is the way that when he launches into visual art, he says he's doing it in relationship to the market. And I think we've lost sight of the fact that in the mid-60s, the market situation was, or felt like it was, very similar to what we have now. And I'm just wondering if either of you, who are both in some ways engaged in the market, have thought about Broodthaers and his declaration in '64 that he was becoming a visual artist in order to make money. I'm wondering if you've thought at all about his role in the market and the role of art in the market now, or your own roles with the market.
It's kind of funny. Yeah, I was thinking, like, I kind of partly got out of doing text-based works because of the market, because it wasn't really very profitable, So, I mean, I started moving away from it because just for survival reasons. But it's very difficult doing that kind of work. So I'd say that there's kind of a reverse trajectory there, on my part, anyway.
Well, on my side, it's well known that I'm not a big success, in terms of...
But of course, neither with Broodthaers.
Can call you a market-driven artist.
No, I wasn't implying that at all. I mean, of course, Broodthaers wasn't a market-driven artist either, really, but he pretended to be, and I was wondering if that was influential.
No, I think what is influential is all the doubts about what an artwork is, and the limits, the definitions, this is, for me, this is like the most important point, I'm never so happy that when I hear, but if it's still art, or that introduces a kind of gray zone where there is really a strong doubt, even recently about the retrospective in Düsseldorf, it was commented that maybe a kind of post-art, maybe I was wondering how I should interpret that, like, does it mean it's not art, But I'm very comfortable with 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 the fact that it's the more it generates other definitions, a difficulty. This resistance. I find this very interesting.
Thank you. I think we had a question just here. Someone's bringing a mic. Thank you.
I'll try to gather some thoughts. I was thinking that, particularly in Broodthaers' work, it seems as if he's mimicking or reproducing, let's say, very banal colonialist museum structures, literally. And there's a whole structural repetition of the museum logic, of the colonial era in Europe, really, very strongly. And it seemed to me that there's a whole kind of performative, let's say, active repetition and reiteration, almost to drive the viewer, what you call the reception of the audience, to a certain displacement of what they already know within common, or museums that nobody even frequented, that he would bring to, that are these, let's say, boring old museums in Europe that are a part of the colonial history. And then he puts that in quotes. And I was wondering if you've thought about, I was particularly thinking with Mr. Graham's work, Vexation Island, how it sort of tries to intervene. I know that's a rather 80s art theory word. Intervene in the, let's call it, discourse of colonialism. Not necessarily, sometimes in a, let's say, bombastic way to some extent, with the bones, with the flag on it, for example. So my question is how you see yourself, or not, or how you contextualize your work, say, in Vexation Island, as dealing with some of these colonialist discourses, and how that relates to the globalization of the economic society order and all that.
Rodney?
Oh, I kind of, although, people have sort of commented on that, but I wasn't thinking of that at all, but it's always there. I was thinking of staging some kind of absolute confrontation between man, humankind, and nature in this sort of in a comedic kind of way. Obviously set on a desert island, so it's not like there's nobody else there, so he's not like actively colonizing the place. But you can't help but think about that. Robinson Crusoe did, So it's not what I was thinking of when I made it. I wanted to stage a kind of basic, kind of like revenge of nature. A seat to set the scene of nature having its revenge on humankind by, like, the coconut kind of falling on this guy's head and kind of knocking him out in a recurring eternal return idea. So I was thinking of something more basic, but obviously those overtones are going to be there.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we can take a couple of more questions, if we have any. Someone in the back.
Hi. So a number of Broodthaers' works, such as the inaugural discussion or the section documentaire, which took place on the beach in Lecoq, they seem to resonate today with ideas of relational aesthetics and social practice. And I was wondering if you could speak to what extent it's useful to kind of look at Broodthaers' work within this framework of social practice from today.
Slick.
Let's give it to the historian.
What was that?
So let's give it to the historian.
Yes, yeah. This is a good question, actually. It's one I was hoping Dominique was going to answer. But I actually think Broodthaers' work is an exquisite way to think about things like social practice, things like relational aesthetics, outside of those catchphrases and in what they are in actuality. So that's kind of one of the reasons I love that image so much of Gilbert and George drinking in the middle of the Jardin d'Hiver, because the Jardin d'Hiver is often discussed as an installation. It's discussed as an aesthetic experience. But it was also a parody, it was also a critique, it was also a demonstration of the history of social spaces, the kind of migration from private plant collections, animal collections, into public museums as we know them, the sort of long history of private collection migrating into public space. I think many of his works like this have implied opportunities for social discourse. In his work, I don't think that is the main subject, but I think it's always in the background, which is that he's not prescribing the necessary meaning of any of these works, but he is open to the discussion. And I think so much of really intriguing social practice gets beyond the kind of catchphrases in these terms and creates opportunity. And it's for the rest of us in a way to activate it or to historicize what takes place within it. And I see that in your work, honestly. I see a lot of kind of openness, not without rules and not without prescriptions, not without references or texts to read or music to listen to. You give us all of those things. But I think within that, I see the resonance of possibility for public social discourse. Which doesn't exist very much.
Would you agree with that, Dominique?
Yeah, I like it when it's not loaded with didactic or moral background, and when it remains something. I think it's very much. I must say I have trouble with heavy instructions or do this or don't do that or read it like this or read it like. So I wouldn't go in that sense. I have a rule which is never to answer a question about relational aesthetic.
Sorry. Do we have a last question? I'm sure we have one more question. Well, if we don't, I'd like to thank you all. Thank you, Dominique. Thank you, Rodney. Thank you, Cathleen. It was great to have you. And thank you all.